The purpose of these lectures is to explore logic. Now, the first thing to do is to figure out exactly what we mean by the word logic. After all, you want to make sure that you are, in fact, studying the right thing before you invest all the time and interest in doing the work. So, what do we mean by the word logic? The word is ambiguous. It has more than one meaning. One sense of the word is subjective. Think about what it means when someone says, "Well, that's logical." What they usually mean is, "That makes sense to me," or "I agree with that." In this case, the notion of logic is connected with personal beliefs. The word logic is used here in order not only to express that I believe this, but that you should too. That is, we use the word logical here in order to endow our beliefs with a certain status that's meant to bolster their reasonability, to place them beyond challenge. It's not only a belief, but a logical belief, and therefore must be correct. The questions connected with this sense are not logical, but psychological. Why do people believe the things they do? When will they doubt the things they believe? For us, in these discussions, we'll mean something different by logic. We mean something objective. Logic, for us, is the study of rational argumentation. Okay, look what we just did. We took one word, logic, that we didn't know the meaning of, and defined it in terms of two words we don't know the meaning of. In philosophy, we call this progress. By rational, we mean that which we have grounds to show is likely true. A belief is rational if we have good reason to believe it's at least probably the case in reality. Now, there are lots of reasons we may believe something. Self-interest. If I convince myself that I love kale, then I'll eat it more often and be healthier. So I do like it, I do like it, I do like it. Or there's consistency. I believe my cousin is a kind, wonderful person, so that guy being mean to that puppy must just be someone else who just looks like my cousin. There's coercion. If I don't believe this, I'm going to hell. Or even aesthetic reasons. I don't know if the man who invented the toilet was really named John Thomas Crapper, but it's far too perfect not to be true. Now, none of these are rational. What we are looking for is those grounds that give us good reason to believe that something is likely to be the case. Now, if your doctor tells you, "We have good evidence from randomized double-blind studies to support the efficacy of this treatment, so I think it has a good chance of curing you," you probably should agree to the treatment. Doing so would be rational. Now, the other word, argumentation, that's the important one. The central term in all of logic is argument. Now, we don't mean what most people mean when we use this word. Now, if you see a bunch of guys outside a bar at 2 a.m. go at it with fists and broken bottles, those aren't logicians. If you see a guy at a bar, it probably isn't a logician. Argument, for us, is not a disagreement. For us, argument is a technical term. It's a linguistic thing. An argument is a set of sentences such that one sentence, what we call the conclusion, is claimed to follow from the other sentences, what we call the premises. Arguments have two parts, a conclusion and premises. The conclusion is the point of the argument. It's the thing which is being argued for, that which we are trying to convince ourselves or others of. We give arguments in order to provide legitimate reasons to believe the conclusion. The premises are those reasons. The premises are the grounds that are being proposed to support rational belief in the conclusion. Every argument has one and only one conclusion. Conclusions are like noses. Everyone has one. More than one conclusion, more than one argument. No conclusion, no argument. Premises, on the other hand, can come in any number, 1, 2, 18. There are mathematical arguments with an infinite number of premises and some weird logical arguments that have no premises at all. So conclusion, one and only one. Premises, any number. Let's consider an example. The old chestnut, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, in this case, the conclusion is Socrates is mortal. That's what the argument is trying to convince us of. Why should we believe that Socrates is mortal? Because he's a man and all men are mortal. The first thing you do when you approach an argument is to find the conclusion and then set out the premises. It's crucially important that you do this correctly. Consider what would happen if we misidentified the conclusion in this case. Now, if it's true that all men are mortal and that Socrates is one of these guys, then it turns out that it's absolutely the case that Socrates is mortal. But suppose we wrongly thought that the conclusion is all men are mortal, and that the premises are Socrates is a man and Socrates is mortal. Just because one man is mortal, it doesn't necessarily follow that they all are. By misidentifying the conclusion and the premises, we've taken a good argument, one that gives us good reason to believe something, and turned it into a flawed argument that does not. So, the first tasks that are necessary for us to develop are 1, figuring out when we have an argument, and 2, determining what the conclusion is and what the premises are. Now, we often have help with these tasks, what we call indicator words. There are certain words we use to point out conclusions, and there are certain words we use to point out premises. Now, think about what a conclusion is supposed to do. It's supposed to be the thing that's established by the argument. So, we use words that indicate this. The most obvious one is therefore. My heart is beating, therefore I'm alive. We use other words for this function as well. Think of thus, hence, and so. There's the Latin ergo, which not only indicates a conclusion, but if used with the appropriately arrogant tone at a dinner party, will keep others from speaking to you for the rest of the evening. Trust me, it works. We do need to be careful, though, that not every use of these words indicates a conclusion. Take the word so. Sometimes it does function in this way. I haven't eaten today, so I am hungry. That I have not eaten gives you good reason to believe that I am in fact hungry. But in the sentence, I am so hungry, now so is not an indicator word. Hungry is not a conclusion. This is a different meaning of so. Instead of synonymous with therefore, it's synonymous with very. We have premise indicator words as well. We use words and phrases like because, since, and given that. Again, not every use of these words is an indication of a premise in an argument. I'm hungry since I haven't eaten all day is a case where since points out a reason for your belief. Why should you believe I'm hungry? Because I haven't eaten today. But in the sentence, I haven't eaten since yesterday, we see since used just to signal time, not as an indicator word. Yesterday is not a premise. Indicator words are the easiest way to determine whether we have an argument, and if so, what the conclusion is and what the premises are. But we don't always have indicator words. How then do we determine if we're looking at an argument? The easiest way is to try to insert your own indicator words. I prefer therefore and because. If you look at a passage and the word therefore can naturally be inserted in a way that maintains the meaning of the passage, you're probably looking at an argument, and what immediately follows therefore, that's your conclusion. Similarly, if you can insert because into a passage without changing the meaning, you're likely looking at an argument, and what comes right after your inserted because, that's probably a premise. Let's practice on a couple of examples. Suppose we say, the first one's a little cheaper, but because of the lack of quality, you'd end up needing to buy 2 of them, where the slightly more expensive one would do the job itself. Okay, twice the less expensive price is still more than that of the more expensive alternative. We should always try to spend the least amount of money needed to get the job done. So, it makes sense to spend the extra money on the more expensive model. We look at this passage, and the first step is to figure out if we have an argument, and then the second step is to pick out the conclusion. Now, we see the indicator word so, and we see that we could substitute the word therefore for it, showing that we do have an argument. So is a conclusion indicator. So, we know that the conclusion is here. The thing being argued for is, it makes sense to spend the extra money on the more expensive model. Now, why should we believe that? That is, what are the premises being offered in support of the proposition? Well, 1, the quality of the less expensive model would necessitate the buying of 2 in order to get the job done. 2, the cost of buying 2 of the less expensive model is more than the cost of buying the more expensive model. 3, it makes sense to spend less rather than more to get the job done. We now know that we have an argument, and we have the complete structure of that argument set out. Here's another. You're dehydrated. You need to drink more water. The human body does not function properly when it's not appropriately hydrated, and you need to maintain full function. Okay, this one's a little tricky because there are no indicator words. Let's see if we can insert our preferred indicator words in a way that maintains the meaning. You're dehydrated, therefore you need to drink more water because the human body does not function properly when it's not appropriately hydrated, and you need to maintain full function. So, we do have an argument. Its conclusion is, you need to drink more water. The full structure would be, 1, you're dehydrated. 2, the human body does not function properly when it's not appropriately hydrated. 3, you need to function properly. Therefore, you need to drink more water. One more. Wear the blue shirt, not the gray. The blue brings out your eyes, the gray makes you look washed out. Now, is this an argument? There are no indicator words, but let's see if we can add because or therefore while maintaining the meaning of the passage. We could say, wear the blue shirt, not the gray, because the blue one brings out your eyes and the gray makes you look washed out. Yeah, that works. So we do have an argument, and what follows because is our premise. What's left then is our conclusion. That is, the point of the passage is to convince you to wear the blue and not the gray shirt. So if we set it out as we have it, then we get 1, the blue shirt brings out your eyes and makes you look better, while the gray shirt washes you out and makes you look worse. Therefore, you should wear the blue shirt instead of the gray. Notice that we're missing something here. The premise is a simple statement of fact, right? This is the way things are. But the conclusion is a normative claim. It says what you should do. The conclusion here does not follow from this premise directly. There is what we call an implicit or suppressed premise. Sometimes a part of the argument is so obvious that we omit it, figuring that it's something that everyone already believes. In this case, the suppressed premise is that you should do what you can to look better rather than worse. Adding it in, we now have 1, the blue shirt brings out your eyes and makes you look better, whereas the gray shirt washes you out and makes you look worse. 2, you should try to do what you can to look better than worse. Therefore, you should wear the blue shirt instead of the gray. The technical term for an argument with a suppressed premise is an enthymeme. It's important to fill out these arguments and to make the suppressed premises explicit, because once we start evaluating arguments, flaws might appear in what goes unstated. So, steps 1 and 2 are figure out if a passage contains an argument, and then to identify the structure, that is, to pick out the conclusion and fully lay out its premises. Step 3 is to determine what kind of argument it is. Arguments come in 2 flavors, deductive and inductive. Now, an argument is deductive if its conclusion is no broader than its premises. That is, if the conclusion only refers to that which is mentioned in the premises. The technical term we use is to say that deductive inferences are non-ampliative. That is, the conclusion is contained within the content of the premises. So reconsider all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, in the premises, we have all men being mortal, but then move to the conclusion to just one of these guys being mortal. Deduction moves from broad to narrow. Inductive arguments are ampliative. That is, they do have a conclusion that's broader than the premises. For example, the Scottish philosopher David Hume famously considers the argument, the sun has risen every other morning, so the sun will rise tomorrow as well. Notice that our premises contain a lot of data, that the sun has risen every single day in the past. But the conclusion is not about one of those days. It's about a day outside the data set. We're using facts about millions of other days to expand our reasonable belief to a new one. In the case of Socrates being mortal, right, we had a claim about all men, and Socrates was one of them. But here we have a collection of data, and the day in the conclusion is not one of them. It's a further instance not contained in the content of the premises. With deduction, we're arguing from broad to narrow. But with induction, we're arguing from narrow to broad. The important result of this difference is in the degree of belief we can reasonably put in the conclusion of these different types of arguments. Since the content of a deductive argument is already contained in the premises, then in a successful deductive argument, the conclusion will be absolutely certain. If all men are indeed mortal, and Socrates is one of those guys, then there is no other alternative but that Socrates is mortal. But with an inductive argument, because the conclusion outruns the premises, we have no guarantees. Just because the sun has always risen, there's no guarantee that it will do so again. It probably will, but not definitely. Successful inductive arguments, because they're ampliative, only give us high probability, not absolute certainty. Consider another inductive argument, one I always use in the classroom. I ask each of the students in the class if he or she has a television at home, and one by one they say yes. I list each premise on the board, as premises, and then add the conclusion, the next person I ask will have a TV. Now, the next person I inform them is whomever I find outside the classroom door. Based on the evidence we have, do we believe that the person I find outside the room will also have a television? The answer is yes. You sure wouldn't want to bet against it, right? But one time, I was teaching logic in a room that was across from a soft drink vending machine. I thought this was wonderful because sometimes we have to wait for a while for someone to wander past the open door to find our next person. But a caffeine and sugar dispenser attracts a constant flow of students. So I open the door and there's a woman purchasing a drink. I asked her if she has a TV at home. In a beautiful French accent, she replied, I'm sorry, I do not own television. Yeah, it can happen. With an inductive argument, because the conclusion lies outside the scope of the premises, there is a risk that even a very good inductive argument might have a false conclusion. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't believe it. We should believe that which is probably true. It's wonderful to achieve absolute certainty, the sort of thing we get from deduction. But in most real-life cases, we are restricted to the high probability of induction. It'll turn out that when we evaluate arguments, when we determine whether an argument is successful or not, whether it has flaws or not, we will need different logical tools for deductive and inductive arguments. So, once we determine if we have an argument, then find its conclusion and fully set out all of its premises, both stated and implied, we must determine whether it's deductive or inductive. Let's try a couple of examples. Drinking caffeinated soda and caffeinated tea after dinner keeps me up at night. So, drinking regular coffee after dinner will keep me up since it's caffeinated too. Step 1, find the conclusion. So, we see the indicator word so, which signals a conclusion. What the passage is arguing for is the proposition that I should not drink regular coffee after dinner. Why should I believe that? What are the premises offered in support? Well, 1, drinking caffeinated soda after dinner keeps me awake at night. 2, drinking caffeinated tea after dinner keeps me awake at night. 3, regular coffee is caffeinated. Notice that the drinking of coffee, which is key to the content of our conclusion, is not contained in the content of the premises. The evidence we are given is the result of the drinking of other beverages after dinner. But the conclusion makes a claim beyond that, a claim about the effects of the drinking of coffee. This means that our inference is inductive. A1 has a property B, A2 has a property B, A3 is like A1 and A2. So we conclude that A3 also has the property B. Note that we can't be certain that the coffee will keep us up, but we have good reason to believe that it is probably going to be the case. Let's try another one. Drinking regular coffee after dinner keeps me up at night because regular coffee contains caffeine, and caffeine after dinner keeps me up. Step 1, find the conclusion. Now, we see the indicator word because, which picks out premises. So, we can say that the conclusion is drinking regular coffee after dinner will keep me up at night. Our premises are 1, regular coffee contains caffeine. 2, caffeine after dinner keeps me up. Now, we look at our conclusion, and unlike the previous example, we notice that there is nothing in the content of the conclusion that outruns the content of the premises. The content of the conclusion is contained within the content of the premises. This is a deductive argument. If the premises are true, that is, if drinking caffeinated beverages after dinner keeps me up at night, and if regular coffee is one of those caffeinated beverages, then we know with absolute certainty that coffee will keep me up. Identifying the parts of the argument and the types of arguments are our initial steps. But the whole point is to determine which ones are good arguments. Which ones give you good reason to believe in the truth of the conclusion? Consider 3 arguments. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is moral. All politicians are Martians. Barack Obama is a politician. Therefore, Barack Obama is a Martian. All presidents of the United States are human. All newborn children are human. Therefore, all newborn children are presidents of the United States. There's one of these 3 that's a good argument. The first one. Now, if all men are mortal, and if Socrates is one of those guys, then we know that Socrates is, or at least was, mortal. But the other 2 are flawed. The second argument should strike you as good in some way, but surely we don't have reason to believe its conclusion, even for those who claim to have a copy of the Martian birth certificate. Similarly, the third argument does seem to have a virtue. Its premises are true. All presidents of the United States have been humans, and all newborn children, given that by children we mean the offspring of humans, are also humans. But again, surely the conclusion is false. So, what's right about the first example, and what goes wrong with the second 2? To evaluate arguments, we use 2 criteria: validity and well-groundedness. Okay, an argument is valid if and only if, assuming the truth of the premises for the sake of argument, the conclusion follows from them. Okay, the important thing to notice here is that we're assuming the premises are true for the sake of argument. Maybe they're true, maybe they're false, we don't care. Validity does not concern the content of the premises. All we're looking at is whether the premises, if true, would lead you to the conclusion. Validity is not about the content of the argument, but about the form of the argument. Validity looks at the skeleton of the argument and determines if it's strong enough to support the weight of the conclusion. Let's look at the first argument. If we take it as true that all men are mortal, and if we take it as true that Socrates is one of those men, then it necessarily follows that Socrates is mortal. This is a valid argument. Similarly with the second argument, if we assume it to be true, just assume it to be true, that all politicians are Martians, and if we take it as true that Barack Obama is a politician, then, again, it necessarily must follow that Barack Obama is a Martian. This, too, is a valid argument. Indeed, from a validity standpoint, it's the same argument as the first. Now, remember, validity only cares about the structure of the argument, not the content. Both of the first two arguments have the same form. All A's are B's, C is an A, therefore C is a B. All arguments of this form will be valid. Let's play Mad Libs. If I ask you for a plural noun, a proper noun, and an adjective, and put them into this form, we get a valid argument. All cats are purple. Pee Wee Herman is a cat. Therefore, Pee Wee Herman is purple. Valid argument. Validity is a function of form. Any conclusion of that form will be true if the premises of that form are also true. Now, consider the third argument. This one is invalid. Yeah, it's true that newborn babies are human, and it is true that all the presidents of the United States are and have been human, but just because they are true, it doesn't follow that newborn children are presidents of the United States. All A's are B's and all C's are B's, but that doesn't mean that all A's are C's. The truth of the premise does not lead to the truth of the conclusion. The problem's not with the premises, but with the form of the argument. That we're assuming the truth of the premises in our first criterion should bother you a little bit. After all, that's a huge assumption to make. What justifies our ability to make such an assumption? Our second criterion, well-groundedness. An argument is well-grounded if and only if all of its premises are true. Well-grounded arguments have true premises. Maybe the conclusion's true, maybe the conclusion's false, but what's important for us in looking at the well-groundedness of an argument is just the truth or falsity of the premises. Our first argument, well-grounded. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. The third argument, also well-grounded. All newborn children are human, and all presidents of the United States are human. But the middle one, not well-grounded. Barack Obama is indeed a politician, but contrary to what the Weekly World News might have you believe, not all politicians are Martians. Certainly no more than half. It's a valid argument. That is, if the premises were true, the conclusion would be. But the premises are not true. As such, we have no good reason to believe the truth of the conclusion. Now, an argument that satisfies both of our criteria, that's both valid and well-grounded, that's what we call sound. A sound argument gives us good reason to believe its conclusion. What we want are sound arguments. In order to determine which arguments are sound, we need to develop tests for validity and well-groundedness. Validity looks at the structural elements of the argument, and its study is called formal logic. Not because you need to dress up to do the work, but because it's an examination of the form of the arguments. Validity for deductive and inductive arguments are completely different matters, and we need different tools, like standard and metric wrenches. We'll delve into both of these in turn. Well-groundedness concerns look at the acceptability of the argument other than the form, and are called informal logic. We'll begin there as we work to build a complete account of the ways we determine what arguments give us good reason to believe their conclusions.